So this is another Friends from the Field webinar, and this series is co-hosted by Blue Hill Heritage Trust, a community conservation organization for the Blue Hill Peninsula, and Island Heritage Trust, which is a land trust for Deer Isle, Stony Point, and the surrounding islands. We're super excited to be hosting Kathy Pollard this evening. It's a topic that is of great interest, I think, to all of us. And I wanted to just share that Blue Hill Heritage Trust is thinking and hoping to start an edible landscape project in the near future. And so this webinar, I think, is going to be really helpful for our learning around this. And if any of you out there are within our community and would like to help support this project going forward, please feel free to reach out. Because we're hoping to partner with Kathy and then also include as many community members as who would like to be involved, because this will definitely be a community project. So feel free to stay in touch with us about that. And I think I'm going to pass it over to Jake for a little tech housekeeping, and then I will introduce Kathy.
Thanks, Lander. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in. One of the most important features that we're going to use today is the chat feature, and you should be able to find that down at the bottom center left of your screen. And you can feel free to ask your questions as Kathy is presenting, but we will save a generous portion of the end of the presentation for question asking. And Lander and I will comb through the chat box the best we can in order and ask Kathy your questions on your behalf. Another very exciting feature is the raise your hand feature, which I believe you can see on your bottom center right. And it can also be found in the panelist tab if you can click on that. And what that does is it allows you to ask Kathy your question directly with your audio. So feel free to use that, and don't be intimidated if you haven't used it before. It usually works out well, and people usually press the button by accident anyway, so no worries. But without further ado, I'll hand it back over to Lander for our formal introduction.
Thank you so much, Jake. That's great. So welcome, Kathy. We're so excited to have you. Kathy is a habitat and permaculture specialist with a background in wildlife ecology and traditional indigenous ecological knowledge. She has a business called Know Your Land Consulting, and she is the project leader for Bangor Land Trust Edible Landscape Project, which is now in its second year, and which she is going to talk to us about today. So Kathy, I'm going to pass it over to you and then pull up your slideshow.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is a topic really near and dear to my heart, and I'll just share a little bit about myself. Lander shared that I have a background in wildlife ecology in order to best understand the flora and the microbes. I was really fortunate to have that formal education. In that time, I worked for the Maine Caribou Reintroduction Project and spent an awful lot of time over in the Bigelow Mountain region and at Baxter State Park doing vegetation surveys. And I also did a lot of monitoring of the caribou when they were released to the wild through what is now very archaic technology called radio telemetry. Instead of GPS, where the satellites do the work of triangulating an animal's position, we had to climb 3 mountains and then triangulate once we had a radio collared caribou's signal. So I spent a lot of time out and about, and all my entire life I've spent outdoors. I was really, really lucky to be in a family that about 60% of our food came from what we either grew, foraged, hunted, or fished. And that was knowledge that was passed on to my dad by his father, who was part Cherokee, and he basically lived completely in a subsistence lifestyle in the late 1800s when he was a boy. And so, he passed that on to dad, and that my dad passed that on to his kids, and I've passed it on to my continuity through the years. But one of the things that knowledge is that it's not human focused, and so the pleasure of humans, and to manage landscapes for the pleasure of humans. And with traditional indigenous ecological knowledge, you look with a more holistic circle eye, and you're looking at the interconnectedness of all life, and acknowledging that humans aren't at the top of a pyramid in terms of controlling that life or that landscape, that it's more of an interactive and respectful relationship that's built over a long time. And so I was really lucky to have that kind of an upbringing, because it really balanced off the other cultural perspectives that I gained as a student of wildlife ecology. So anyway, I've worked in a number of arenas, including medicine. I've worked in traditional recovery, so all the foods that are healthy foods from a traditional indigenous perspective have been, in many cases, lost over the years due to all the conditions that one might anticipate with people having been restricted to reservations and whatnot. And part of health recovery is bringing back a lot of those traditional foods. So I've done that for a number of years and actually continue to do that. Know Your Land Consulting. And my goal is just to take the whole package of a lifetime of knowledge that I've been privileged to acquire and help other people to better understand their land, and the different systems that are in place on their landscapes that they're taking care of. And so as part of that, I was asked by Bangor Land Trust, probably a lot of you know Lucy Quimby, president of Bangor Land Trust. I had the privilege of meeting her a couple of years ago and sharing some of the traditional indigenous diet recovery, food systems recovery that we had been doing. And she proposed that I help Bangor Land Trust to fulfill a long-held dream of having an edible landscape within their conserved lands. And so I said yes. To me that was just one of the greatest honors in my lifetime to be asked to help with something like that. So if you want to change the slide, I can start sharing a little bit more about Bangor Land Trust. It's
my usual button isn't working, so I'm just gonna play around with it here for a second. Sorry
in
about
terms
that.
of the land. Don't know whether it has. Okay.
Oh,
Is
there
it?
we go.
Okay. Oh, great.
I did it.
So Bangor Land Trust has conserved over 850 acres of land in a really ecologically sensitive area called the Penobscot Marsh. And so the picture on the left is sort of a picture of the different parcels that they've been able to conserve surrounding this really beautiful marsh that's in a highly commercialized area of Bangor, and has been very vulnerable to the sprawl that happens both from urban development as well as commercial development. And just as an example, if you look at the right-hand picture, you can see that surrounding this marsh up in the upper middle area is a tremendous amount of development, including Home Depot and the great big Walmart box store, both of them about the marsh. And so Bangor Land Trust has been trying to to all the different threats that can occur with aggressive development. The Penobscot Marsh has a stream that flows into the Penobscot River down in the right-hand corner. And if you go back to the marsh area, until pretty recently, that was about a mile or a half, maybe 3/4 of a mile by a 1/4 of a mile wide shallow lake. Beaver had impounded a tremendous amount of water. And for as long ago as I can remember, it's been a really important flyway for migrating waterfowl. Because of all these different development proposals, the beaver dams have been destroyed and most of the water has been drained out of the marsh. And unfortunately, Bangor Land Trust hasn't been able to acquire enough of the surrounding area to put a stop to that and allow the beaver to live their lives there as they normally would. It's the beaver who created the little lake or pond. It's a big pond, so I would call it a little lake. But it's the humans in this tension between the wildlife and resulted in a tremendous loss of diverse and wildlife and bird life, both resident and migrating. Birds of all kinds. And additionally, if you go north and eastward, there's actually a corridor that's protected all the way up to Mount Katahdin. So there's contiguous wildlife habitat all the way. One of the things that's really important to note is that when habitat is threatened, the way I've described it, the existing and remaining habitat is all the more important to all the species who call those places home. And so when you manage that land, whether it's threatened land or just, capacity to reproduce and survive. So if you want to change the slide, go right ahead. I'm not quite sure it's stable internet connection. Okay, so now, Landair, if you want to just kind of click through the slides, we can look at some of the different species who call that area home. It's as one would expect, any place that has water and then a variety of different habitats is going to have thousands and thousands of species of life relying on that space. So if you, let's see, can you go back to the one just before that, please?
Sorry, Kathy, for some reason on my end, I'm having difficulty. Is that it right there?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that I think is applicable to any conserved land is that they are the homelands and waters of resident wildlife, plants, insects, and really all who comprise that complex ecological web of a given place. And seasonally, not unlike Maine's human population, There's an influx of visitors and migrants who need shelter and food as they settle in to nest and reproduce and build strength for the next leg of their journey. Improving habitat by adding the edible permaculture helps create these little pockets of oases in the environment that are otherwise too often negatively impacted or altered by humans. And one of the really beautiful things is that these mitigations really constitute a form of grace, because as human beings, we can give back and build long-term relationships with places through taking care of permaculture, and it becomes a form of reciprocity for all the ways that we benefit from having these natural areas to enjoy. So that's one of the things that I really love about it. Okay, you can change the slide. So Bangor Land Trust parcels are ecologically diverse from grasslands that abut that extensive freshwater marsh to 150-year-old pine forest, late successional mixed hardwood, beech, hemlock. There are many streams and a now abandoned beaver pond that promote wetland diversity. And the Penobscot Marsh itself has been a favorite stopover, as I mentioned, for the migrating waterfowl for a very long time. Not surprisingly, when we did a flora and fauna survey of the entire, more or less 850 acres, we found wild rice very well established in the marsh itself. That was quite a joyful discovery. Additionally, an extensive and what at that time, 35 years ago, was a very brutal clear cut. So there's about probably 100 acres in recovery from having been just cut flat. Okay, you can change it. And if you just want to go through the slides now, this shows a little bit of the landscape. So the grasslands, mature forest, it's hemlock there. This is the marsh itself. We were there in the springtime, and this really stunning storm came through, and the flat expanse allowed us to see it in a way that was really spellbinding. There are fields with wild apples, or apples that were planted a long time ago, including crab apples, and they're abundant in wild strawberries and a lot of other permaculture as well. More fields with us not forgetting about the spiders. There are these pools in addition to the big former lake. There are side pools which have a lot of muskrat activity and beaver, otter, and of course they're filled with wild rice. That's a close-up of wild rice in bloom. And wild rice is probably, as far as an aquatic plant goes, it feeds so many different species of insects, birds, fish, frogs, turtles, you name it, they feed on wild rice in one form or another. So it's an incredibly important plant in an aquatic ecosystem. It's just a little reflection of the moon on the water of the bigger pond. Part of the forest structure is allowing the dead and dying material to stay standing, because it provides these wonderful feeding opportunities and home for all kinds of tree nesting birds, trunk nesting birds. Just some more pictures in the foreground here. I don't know whether anyone recognizes the elderberry that's growing wild out there. That was a really nice thing to find. It's actually really prolific out along the edges of the bog, the marsh. This is something, I put this in because it was a discovery that left me awestruck. If you look at just the picture as it is right now, it's about a 10-acre view that you're looking at of willow. And then if you go to the next slide, it shows a close-up of the willow. And it's basically what's called coppiced willow. And so people in England use willow a lot for basket making, and they have the root system, and then they cut seasonally, each year they cut the shoots and new shoots grow. And what I found here is that that entire 10-acre field of wetland is a beaver managed coppiced willow field. And so the beaver have been practicing permaculture there for who knows how long. They were very old willow root systems. And I just found that really, really neat because, it's evidence that humans don't always have all the answers, that other animals are able to come up with some pretty good plans as well for how to feed themselves. And the significance of this particular discovery is that often beaver eat themselves out of their pond habitat, and they have to move on to a new place. If you can have such a large, extensive patch of edible permaculture at hand that's constantly renewing itself, you don't have to leave your wetland after a few years. And so it gives the beaver the capacity to stay in one place, just like humans eventually evolved to practice agriculture, which allowed humans to stay in one place. So I found that really fascinating. And in all my wandering all through the state of Maine, I've never seen another example of that. So I thought I'd share that with you all. There's some more good pictures of the slice, the angular cut that the beaver do to harvest their willow. So that kind of gives you a good picture. It really just a tip of the iceberg, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of the land that I've been working and talk about permaculture now. And we know anyone who goes out in the wild knows that there's a ton of permaculture already out there. Otherwise, wildlife wouldn't be able to sustain themselves. But the benefit of adding permaculture is twofold. And the goal that Bangor Land Trust cited to me was that they wanted to improve the habitat by adding more food for the animals, but also they saw it as a way that people can, it's just another facet that people who visit the preserves can engage with that land, and in some cases waterways as well. So by allowing people to come onto the land to forage and harvest, it gives them another way that they can just be in relationship with that place. And perhaps for some, it also, eventually could provide an added element of greater food security. So I don't know whether you can go to the next slide. I've lost the slides, Landair.
Hey, Kathy, I'm going to try resharing because on my end it was backing up and I couldn't share. I couldn't forward. So I'm going to share one more time.
Okay, sorry, folks.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay.
So on that previous slide, I said that when you look at how do you get permaculture when you start, when you start a permaculture project, how do you get the foods? How do you start something like that? And you can acquire them from taking cuttings of existing plants and propagating them to develop root systems, and kind of creating a little nursery to take care of those plants until they're strong enough to be transplanted out into the wild. You can also dig up and replant shoots and sprouts of self-propagating plants. Think of raspberries, how they continually are moving. So they're permaculture, but they're permaculture on the move. and every year they're putting out new sprouts. You can dig those up and bring them to a place that you want to start a raspberry patch. You can start seed, such as walnut and acorns, and transplant those little trees when they get big enough. And then you can purchase native plants from reputable nurseries. And I do want to say a couple things about native plants versus, non-native plants. And at least for the work that I do, I work with native plants because it's really important to maintain the balances that are out there. And if you bring in something from a different country, that might be cultivated in somebody's garden space, when you put it out in the wild, it has, especially if it can self-propagate, it might have the capacity to overrun some of the native foods. So we work with that. But on the other hand, we're also looking at global warming and seeing a change in our, basically our temperatures, and our growing season is lengthening. And so one of the interesting variables about that is that some trees that have only grown as far north as, say, central Maine, maybe the Waterville area and south of that, are now capable of growing farther north. And that would include, for example, white oak. The acorns that you see in my hand are red oak acorns, but I'm actually bringing in some white oak into the area. It does exist, but not prolifically already. But it's a native species, and it's just kind of pushing its northernmost limit further north to have that capacity to reproduce. One of the really neat things about white oak is that the acorns have less acid in them than the red oak. And so if humans are gathering them as a food source for flour, they're easier to process. The other really nice thing about white oak is that I grew up, I'm a basket maker, and my very first baskets were made of white oak, which is a traditional Cherokee material for basket weaving. So it's really nice to have the possibility of doing those different, having the splints possibly available eventually as well up this way. I haven't used white oak in a really long time. So if you could go to the next slide. Are you still there?
I am, Kathy. Can you see the next slide?
Yeah, I can't see it.
Let's see. I turned my video off because we're having a little bit of connection problem. So I was trying to like help with that. But so you can see that one.
I can't see any slides. I can just see Jake as a blank screen and you as a moose and me. But that's it. So it booted out the central slide piece.
Very strange. Let me try again.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
No, I can't. But that's okay. If you can tell me what it is, then I can go from there.
Jake, can you see it?
I just want to tune in. I can see the screen in the slides.
Okay.
So I don't.
It's probably on my end then. A little technical difficulty.
And Barbara just let us know that she can see the slides as well.
Okay.
I'm just going to get my daughter to come over here, and it booted the slides off the screen for me. Okay. Sorry, guys. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
It just did that by itself.
Let me see if I can fix it. Just a second. Turn the keyboard back on. So I think it was just some sort of pop-up that we have to exit out of. And if we go back on Zoom.
Oh, there. All right.
Okay.
So in keeping with that concept of climate change and some of these different trees having the capacity to reproduce where they had not in the past, in Orono, we have some black walnut trees that were planted by the university ages ago. And for the most part, they've done well. They're old trees, 85 to 100 years old. They produce walnuts, but if you in the past, if you were to break open one of the walnuts, you would see that the meat of the walnut didn't get fat. In other words, it's just a little shriveled meat, but that also means that the seed is not fertile. And in the last few years, that has changed. We're getting just enough extra time on our growing season where black walnuts in Orono, Maine are able to become reproductive. They fill out enough where they can reproduce. And 2 years ago, a phenomenon occurred that I had never seen in my 35 years of living in Orono. Everywhere I looked around town, I was seeing baby black walnut trees pop. See, that's a little baby black walnut tree in Orono in its flower bed. And these squirrels had planted and a whole bunch of them sprouted into baby trees. And so keeping an eye out for opportunities like this is one of the really nice things about an edible landscape project. I got permission from University Credit Union and Woodman's Bar and Grill to dig up these baby trees. So if you go to the next slide. So there's one from University Credit Union's flower bed, the walnut itself and how the tree sprouts right out of the walnut. Yeah. Anyway, oh yeah, so there's the black walnut buried, and it probably had a husk on it, but the husk disintegrated through the winter. The squirrel buries it to store it away and then forgets where she or he has buried it, and up comes the baby tree from the nut itself. So we gathered up about 100 of these wayward black walnut. Well, for one thing, they have a toxin in the roots that kills a lot of other vegetation around them. We dug them up and we transplanted them out in Bangor Land Trust in a suitable place so that they'll grow up to be really big trees and produce black walnuts for decades and decades. So you can go to the next slide. That's just a picture of me planting some raspberries. And you can go to the next slide. These are some American chestnut trees. You probably have all heard of the effort to recover American chestnuts by producing resistant varieties to the chestnut blight. And so one of the really neat things about an edible landscape project is the capacity to collaborate with different projects and groups. And we were able to get a couple. These actually went to a client of mine up in Bridgewater, Maine, but we were able to get a few American chestnuts to plant out on the Bangor Land Trust as well. And you can go ahead. And these are some blackberries that actually came from a patch down in Blue Hill. I spotted a few wayward strands, little baby canes, and surreptitiously dug a few of them up and transplanted them, and they grew to produce. And although if we go to the next slide, we're looking at high bush blueberry. And we all know, especially where you guys are down along the coast, and I'm thinking Surrey in particular, there are lots and lots of blueberry barrens, but they're low bush blueberry, wonderful, wonderful. But when you talk about accessibility, one thing I love about high bush blueberry is that you're picking at your waist level. And so for older people who don't have the capacity any longer to bend over or to kneel down, they're still able to gather blueberries comfortably. So we actually purchased about 80 high bush blueberry plants from from a reputable nursery and have been putting them out on the land in various stages. So the next slide just shows, you know, one of the forms of wild permaculture. Of course, everyone knows fiddleheads. And I just want to reiterate that in addition to all the different ones that I mentioned here, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's possible when you're talking about an edible landscape project. We also put out a lot of elderberry because that's another plant that people can easily gather. And if we go to the next slide, one of the real beauties of an edible landscape project is the capacity for community engagement. And I'm a real proponent of multi-generational engagement. So targeting youth in particular. If you look at land trust board composition, or even, not even boards, but even just the primary constituency, oftentimes it's older people. And particularly for land trust boards, once those people retire off the boards, if there isn't this engagement of younger people, you know, it's hard to get people to serve and volunteer. So a big part of the focus of Bangor Land Trust Edible Landscape Project has been engaging youth. We had a wonderful year planned, and of course COVID came and prevented us from being able to carry through with some of our plans, but we're hoping that we can pick up the threads in the coming school year and kind of be on hiatus this year and carry forward. But youth can be engaged through collaborations with public and private schools. A lot of kids have service project requirements. Boy Scouts have Eagle project requirements. Science classes can take on a piece of a project. We had Bangor 8th graders, earth science students, they were going to be raising baby white oak trees and then helping to plant them out come spring. That couldn't happen this year, but we're on track to have it happen next year if we can get the you know, COVID under control. Community members of all ages can be recruited to participate in planting, watering, monitoring the permaculture. Sometimes it requires some pruning. And also a lot of people have a berry patch or some other form of permaculture. Grapes, grape cuttings are great. It's easy to dig up blackberries, raspberries, black caps, etc. So, you know, that providing this or improving the abundance of food in a given area. And the other thing that I think is really important is being inclusive of all abilities. So I mentioned, you know, the high bush blueberries, but also just, you know, having an awareness that if you're going to put permaculture along trails, that the trails perhaps be you know, at least a portion of it be handicap accessible, so that, you know, people can experience that joy of getting out there and you know, picking a few berries or whatever it might be. So you know, I've situated a lot of permaculture out in the acreage where no human, you know, they might wildlife, but then there's a lot of permaculture closer to parking areas and trails that are easy to access, tucked along the sides and in alcoves and whatnot, so that humans can also enjoy foraging. And I know I'm running a little bit over. The last piece that I wanted to talk about is the land acknowledgement. When we look at anywhere in Maine, it's important to acknowledge that it's the homeland of Wabanaki people, and depending on what tribe, you know, whose territory one is in. In the case of Bangor Land Trust, they're in Penobscot territory. And if you go down to the next slide, I just want to point out that if you know what to look for, no matter where you are in Maine, you're going to come upon signs of people who had used that land for thousands and thousands of years, 15 or more thousand years before it was taken. In this case, these are two pieces of feldsite that I found out on Bangor Land Trust when I was doing my surveys. Both of them have been Penobscot people at some time were on that land. So that's kind of cool. But in recognition of that, Bangor Land Trust had a really strong interest in ensuring that there was a sense of welcome for Penobscot people. The reservation is just 6 miles away, but typically because of generations and generations of Native people being told to get back to the reservation, people are hesitant to be out on land, even though it's homeland. They're hesitant to feel safe and welcome. And so Bangor Land Trust endeavored to create a multicultural element to our edible landscape project. And with the generous funding of a funder, and I hope they don't mind me saying who, Broadreach Fund, they helped us to set up some really neat programming around the importance of acknowledgement. One is that Bangor Land Trust has created a GIS map, and the GIS map has acknowledgements on it. So every person who puts a map in their pocket and then takes it out to look at the trails is going to see Penobscot words for birch trees or whatever feature it might be. They're going to see that right on the map. They're going to see a concept called the 4 R's about sustainability on the back, and they're going to see what the place name Kanjajuak means. That will be defined. And so that's one element. The other is that for all of the permaculture that's intended for ease of humans to harvest, we will have signage that has a picture of the plant, and then in both Penobscot and English will be the plant's name. So that's a way for people, very matter-of-factly, that there's this acknowledgement of the land being taken care of in the past by other people. And then there are a number of other, we have a culture series. Every month we have a speaker from the Penobscot Nation or a Wabanaki speaker sharing various pieces of culture. For example, on the 26th of this month, we have Suzanne Greenlaw, who's a PhD student at UMaine. She's going to share the work that she's been doing with Acadia National Park for allowing indigenous people to be harvesting sweetgrass again in the marshes of Acadia National Park. It's just one example. So all in all, this edible landscape project, we already have talked about several facets of it, but that there are many other facets, and that's really the beauty of a project like this, is that you can shape it to whatever the thoughts and needs are of the land trust or land conservation organization, and be able to pull in and weave in all these different elements that give it added richness. So with that, I will open it up to questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Kathy. That was wonderful and inspiring. And thank you all for hanging in there with us with our tech challenges this evening. And as Kathy said, yes, please ask questions in the chat box, or as Jake said earlier, with your little virtual hand, and I can unmute you. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if that helps with our tech with our connection as well.
So Kathy, we had one question here. Let me find it again. Sorry, it was I think Barbara was just kind of asking you to go back over briefly permaculture. I think you lagged a little bit when you were speaking of the context, and you mean all consumers. That's where she left off.
all consumers. Does she want me to define permaculture?
I think, yeah, maybe just like a brief summary of
Sure.
what you went over. What you went over was a little more complex, but just a brief
Yeah.
summary of that.
Yeah. So permaculture is just all the plants that grow all by themselves out in nature. And when you take a walk on any of the Blue Hill preserves, you'll see an abundance of green of all sizes, shapes, colors, etc. That's permaculture. Edible permaculture are the plants that reproduce edible foods. So apple trees produce fruit, berries produce a seed, wild rice is a seed. There are roots that can be eaten, mushrooms. So all of that is permaculture. It's food that self-propagates and continues to supply an abundance of food for a long, long time. In the case of, for example, I mentioned the walnut trees will produce for 100 or more years. High bush blueberries will produce, each bush will produce about 4 gallons of blueberries for about 35 years, every year for 35 years. Raspberries just keep on going. They go on and on and on. They'll move. They might not be in the same place 30 years down the road because they're looking for light. But the point is, most permaculture gets planted. If you're adding it to the land, you plant it out there, and then thereafter it takes care of itself.
Thank you, Kathy. We have more questions pouring
sure.
in.
Great.
And a bunch of praise as well. We have 2 hands raised. So maybe I'll do one more chat box question and then we'll get to the hands that are raised. Okay, so Sarah asks, how small can an edible garden be? For coastal areas, what plants do you recommend the most for an edible garden?
How small can a coastal garden be? If you wouldn't normally concentrate permaculture all in a little garden like you do planting annual garden type produce, because permaculture has specific needs in terms of what the soil is, what the height, the elevation is, what the water amount is. And so you have to really know what the plant, where the plant wants to be sited, and then put it there. Sometimes you can concentrate in a yard, if you have a fairly, an acre or so, I think would be enough to put quite a bit out there. But there are some plants that might not like that particular microenvironment. And so, they'd have to be put elsewhere. And as far as coastal plants, that depends on the soil. I know down your way, there's a lot of sand and granite and not a lot of loam. Is that correct? Like rich, deep soil. There probably isn't a lot of that.
I think you're right.
Okay, so it really depends. For example, an American chestnut tree needs to have a capacity of its roots to go straight down into the earth about 20 feet or so. So it couldn't have a substrate of granite 6 inches below the surface. So it's really, it sounds complicated, but once you learn, the ins and outs of it, it's pretty easy. My client up in Bridgewater is an 83-year-old man, and it was his lifelong dream to create a lot of permaculture on his land. And by the time I visited him last in the fall, he was actually getting it and was anticipating. We had bought a lot of different plants, and he was able to start picking out where they needed to be situated. So it's something that, with help and a bit of mentoring, people can learn very quickly what goes where. But it's all case specific, I guess, is to distill it to one answer. It just depends on what the plant is and what its needs are.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. I'm gonna let Barbara speak if you intentionally raised your hand. I think you just have to unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I was just sort of asking for that clarification about it sort of is permaculture for all creatures. And I think, yes, that was the answer. And I love that. I just thought of it differently, but it's much better this way.
Thanks, Barbara.
And each creature has its needs, which is the, really, that's the intricacy of it, is that each creature, whether it's a traveling monarch butterfly, they have a very specific need of milkweed. And so, again, it's not always what is good food for humans. We're thinking on a much bigger scale of what's good for all life. And so trying to be considerate of adding permaculture that maybe humans will never use, but that will be very welcome for wildlife.
Thanks, Kathy. Lander, do we have another hand raised?
We do, Jake. We have 2 more actually.
Okay, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we let those folks ask their questions, and then you and I can go through the chat box and the questions the best we can before time is out.
Perfect. Okay, Randy, I'm going to let you talk and you just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. That was great, Kathy. Very much.
Thank you.
A question for Lander. Lander, I'm guessing you've already thought about how to incorporate permaculture into your wonderful teacher training forest days program. How do you see that evolving, and how involved do you think schools might on the peninsula be able and willing to engage different age groups in the kind of sophisticated expansion of the program that Kathy outlined?
Yeah, that's a great question, Randy. In terms of forest days, we're still in kind of the initial phase of introducing that to teachers. And this is kind of an outdoor play-based, place-based program for teachers and students on the Blue Hill Peninsula. And I do dream, it hasn't come into play yet, but I do dream of, if they're establishing outdoor classrooms, having those outdoor classrooms be a place where some permaculture could take place. And I don't exactly know how that would happen yet, but I think on school grounds, it could be amazing. And then I know that schools are interested in participating. Back at Surrey Forest a couple of years ago, there's a nursery that was established, and a bunch of Surrey school students came out and helped plant in that nursery. So I think that there is interest, and I really look forward to working with Kathy to expand those opportunities for everyone here. Thanks, Randy.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, we have another hand. Gail, I'm gonna unmute you here.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. That was an inspirational talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much.
You had mentioned cultural use agreements.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak more about those?
Sure. If you're familiar at all with traditional Native culture, before people were confined to reservations, Wabanaki people traveled seasonally to be able to use food resources that, if they were upriver for the winter, they could go down to the coast for the clamming season and the fishing season, and early 1900s and probably even before that, Native people haven't had access to all those critical resources, food resources, medicine resources, and culturally significant. And so a cultural use, let me back up. If you look at the composition of right now, a lot of the prime land is privately owned, but one of the roles that are really wonderful about particularly coastal land trusts is that they provide access to the coast for all people and protect resources along the coast. But but land trusts and land conservation organizations in general have always had a leave no trace model of use. Leave no trace means you go in, you don't take anything, you don't disturb anything, and you leave. And that's really the antithesis of traditional Native American relationship with place, which is a reciprocal relationship of give and take, including being able to harvest resources. And so there's a lot of interest right now, and it's being led by Peter Forbes's First Light organization and a number of tribal organizations to help land conservation organizations realize that they can play a role in helping to restore, sorry about that, my dogs are barking, helping to restore some of that access for native foragers. And a cultural use agreement is a agreement between a land conservation organization and a tribal entity that permits the tribal people to go on that conserved land to harvest food and other resources, maybe ash. And it's a really complex thing because it's really hard to make that paradigm shift from leave no trace, don't take anything, don't, just go in, to accepting that this has been an ongoing way of interacting and having relationship with place for many, many, many thousands of years without any detriment to those places. So, that it's two different cultural paradigms that have to be married in a way, and that requires these cultural use agreements so that everyone understands what the limits are and so forth. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kathy. We have, I think we have time for just two more questions. Mary was inquiring about the artifact that you found in Penobscot. Could you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Both of those images are of, it's called lithic remains. Lithic means stone. And the primary stone that was used before metal was introduced by colonists was felsite. And both of those stones are felsite. Felsite is an amazing, amazing material. And I used to go into schools and do a little bit of the LD 291 teaching with kids and talk about Native American technology. And felsite allowed people to harvest a moose. And when you think of it, how do you get that moose to the dinner table? How do you reduce that moose to meat simmering in a pot? Felsite, if you bang off a flake of felsite, and you could see on one of the photographs flakes of felsite, that material is as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. You literally could do surgery with that material. And so I used to take a stake into the schools, a really thick stake, and show the kids how that could be cut up, and they would be in awe because all it was one slice, gentle slice across, and it was able to cut the meat with no effort at all. It was made into spears and all different tools. So that's when you see felsite on the land like that, and especially felsite that's been worked and it has a characteristic appearance as was shown in the pictures, it's unequivocal evidence that Native people were there at some time.
That's amazing, Kathy. We're gonna have to get you a steak next time. We to
do the demo
demonstration. I think we have time for maybe just one more question, and or maybe two. Maybe we can squeeze them both in. But Ellen was wondering about the rice harvesting presentation. Maybe you could share that with Lander, and we could provide more information on that in the follow-up email.
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Ellen, for that question. And then beyond that is just a lot of praise for you, and thank you for your time and your expertise. And I think I got to all the questions, and if I didn't please follow up with Lander or I, and maybe we can connect you with Kathy and we can answer your question if there was any unanswered.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody for tuning in and you know, for all being a part of this amazing movement that when you think back to 40 or more years ago, there were very few public access places in Maine, and now cumulatively land trusts and land conservation organizations own more than 1 million acres that have been protected into perpetuity. And that takes people of all different means coming together and making it happen, whether it's donating finances or whether it's doing the work of writing grants or whatever it might be. So, you know, and thanks so much for just having that interest in being a part of protecting it all and sharing it out, because Maine sure is a beautiful place.
Yes, it is, Kathy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Kathy, and I look forward to following up with you about potential Blue Hill Heritage Trust projects. We'll have to
Awesome.
catch up soon. Thank you so much again. It was a wonderful
you.
evening. And thank you
Okay,
all for
take
joining.
care, everybody. Be well.
Bye.
So long.